Good afternoon, everyone. Bruchim Habaim, which literally translates from the ancient text as, please make sure your cell phones are on silent. Okay? So we don't want to have interruptions on this afternoon where we're coming together as a community to commemorate the Shoah. I'm Rabbi Neil Katz, and I'm honored to be up here with Rabbi Lerner from the other congregation, from Ahavat Achim, as we, together with new friends and old friends from the community, from the two congregations, share in this moment. So on the program that you have, anything that is in red will be jointly read as we make our way through the service. And so I'm going to begin just by welcoming everyone to Bethel. There's going to be some PowerPoint up here, some music that's going to come up from here, a couple little videos, and then our speaker is going to share a video from there as well. So as long as you can see this screen, I think you should be good. Can you see? And then we're also recording it just privately on the back end for YouTube for our own preservation. So we begin with a meditation, and we'll read responsively. We are taught that the universe whispers that all things are intertwined. Yet at times we hear the loud cry of discord. To which voice shall we listen? Although we long for harmony, we cannot close our ears to the noise of war, the din of terror, the rasp of hate. How dare we speak of concord when the fact and symbols of our age are cruelty and terror and the smoke of concentration camps and bombs? Together, the intelligent heart does not deny reality. We must not forget the grief of yesterday,
nor ignore the pain of today, but yesterday is past.
It cannot tell us what tomorrow will bring. If there is goodness at the heart of life, then its power, like the power of evil, is real. Which shall prevail? Moment by moment we choose between them, and if we choose rightly and often enough, the broken fragments of our world will be restored to wholeness. Together, for this we need help to a power beyond us. God has many names, but God is one. God creates, and God sustains. God loves. God inspires us with a hope, and we can make ourselves one as God is one.
I'll ask everybody to please rise for the blowing of the shofar. The shofar is one of the most ancient instruments of communication. And so when we blow the shofar in the beginning of our service, it's basically to announce, to get everybody's attention. When we blow the shofar at the end of the service, it's a call to action. Please be seated.
We invite our candle lighters to come line up. For our first candle, tonight, we light 6 candles in memory of those who perished in the Holocaust, in solidarity with those who survived, and in honor of those who resisted. We light these memorial candles to bring light to a world that has been darkened by the chaos of the Holocaust.
For our first candle, I welcome Linda Thomas, a member of Ahavat Achim, to light a candle in memory of all the women, young and old, who perished in the camps, mothers who witnessed the deaths of their children, women who risked all to bring new life into the death camps, mothers who had to choose the life of one child over another, or their life over their child's.
For our second candle, I welcome Olivia and Kai, members of Congregation Ahavat Ahim, to light a candle in memory of the children, of young lives snuffed out before they had a chance to live, dreams never fully dreamt, let alone realized, childhoods cut short.
For our third candle, I welcome Dr. Michael Tobes, President, Congregation Ahavat Ahim, to light a candle for all the men who could do nothing to save themselves, their families, their friends, their neighbors, nothing but teach them dignity, courage, and faith.
For our fourth candle, I welcome Jay Jerkins, Professor of Humanities and Philosophy at Tyler Junior College and former president of Congregation Bethel, to light a candle in honor and memory of the scholars and sages, the writers and artists who created Jewish literature and learning and established the patterns of Jewish life that are no more, that now illuminate our memories as we strive to be guided by their light. With them, we remember the communities and culture that were destroyed, the music of towns and villages that is no longer heard, the poetry of life that is gone forever.
For our fifth candle, I welcome Hannah Dietz, Holocaust survivor and member of Congregation Bethel, to light a candle in memory of those who survived, who lived through the nightmare and began life anew, those who had the strength to reopen their wounds, to share stories with later generations, and those for whom the memory was too painful to bear.
For our sixth candle, I welcome Reverend Ginger Brandt of First Christian Church, to light a candle in honor and memory of those righteous Gentiles who risked their lives to save Jewish lives, who hid neighbor or stranger, who fed them, who tended their wounds, and in memory of the 5 million Gentiles who also died at the hands of the Nazis.
May these lights guide us in our healing and in our remembrance.
This time we're going to take a moment for hearing the words of this song at the bottom of the first page, Eli, Eli. Many of you know this particular text. There's a young woman who left Hungary from where she was born, Hannah Senesh. In 1939, she emigrated to then Palestine to join in the building of the land. She lived out of kibbutz. If you know where Caesarea is, up on the coast, it's the next town down is Sdot Yam. So she was there, and she was famous for her poetry. Hannah wrote a number of pieces, including one called Halecha Caesarea, a walk along Caesarea. She's just writing about being on the beach. But because Hannah then was trained by the British forces during World War II to become a paratrooper, and then chose to go back to Europe and to parachute behind enemy lines to help save Jews, for which she was caught and then ultimately executed, she's become a folk hero, and her poems have survived as a testament of a hero. This particular melody was put to, the lyrics were put to a melody by David Zahavi, and this has become a core song of memory for the Holocaust. So we listen to the beautiful rendition by Susan Collin of Eli, Eli.
Shalom,
Mizmor leDavid, Adonai roi lo etzar, bino deshed yaretzeni. Al me menuchon yanachaleni, nafshi yishovei, yenashi yoshe v'nachalei, v'machalei tzadeh, leman shemo, gam ileh getamabeh, lo yera katai madi, shiftecha umish antecha, shiftecha umish antecha, hema yenachamuni, taruk lefanai, taruk lefanai, taruk lefanai, shochan neged sororai, deshanta veshemen deshanta roshi, deshanta vashemen roshi, kosi revaya ato vachesed. Yerifoni kol yemei chayai, v'shavti beveis Adonai, v'shavti beveis Adonai, le'orech yamim. Let us continue together in English with Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God makes me to lie down in green pastures. God leads me beside the still waters. God restores my soul and leads me on the path of the righteousness for God's name's sake. Yea, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We continue together with the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. We continue responsively. You shall love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your strength, and with all your being. Set these words which I command you this day upon your heart. Teach them faithfully to your children. Speak of them in your home and on your way, when you lie down and when you rise up. The world is not the same as Joshua. The decisions we make, the values we teach, must be pondered not only in the halls of learning, but also before the inmates of the. Bind them as a sign upon your hand. Let there be a symbol between your eyes. Inscribe them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. Some are guilty, all are responsible. Be mindful of all my commandments and do them, so you shall consecrate yourselves to your God. Holiness.
On the third page there's a text at the top that I'm not going to read because it's actually part of the video. The song you heard a moment ago, Eli Eli, was just audio. We're going to actually watch a video now, and I'm going to take a second to load it correctly. So you're going to see a video. It's a beautiful couple in Israel. Some of you have seen their videos. It's a husband and wife. They're collectively called Yonina. I think it's a made-up word. But they were going to sing a particular text. It's Ani Ma'amin, which is on the page. But I just want to share that they're just singing the first half, the famous half. And again, the text that's on the page will also be in the video. It's just if you can't see it very well, you can read it there. The text, though, comes from Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith, Ani Ma'amin b'emunah shlema, b'viat HaMashiach Ani Ma'amin. It translates, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. And then there's that beautiful B part, which is not in this recording, which is V'af al pi sheyitmameha im kol zeh achakelo. Even if the Messiah be delayed, I still wait. B'chol yom sheyavo, for the day when the Messiah arrives. And you'll hear in the music and in the reading why this becomes connected to, why this 800-year-old text becomes connected to Holocaust commemoration, as we listen to this beautiful music.
אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, באמונה שלמה, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין.
אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, באמונה שלמה, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין.
So I have the distinct honor of introducing a video, which I just did with that video, but I'm going to introduce a video that's actually an introduction. So I'm not going to introduce our speaker, but Gary Gross, who is the president of this congregation, was unable to be here today. He had already had travel plans, but he was so excited for Nico to be coming, and he said, let's record me for 2 minutes just introducing. So I'm going to introduce Gary, and then we're going to invite up our speaker, Nico.
Hi, I'm Gary Gross. I'm the president of Congregation Bethel. And along with our colleagues at the synagogue, we have created, I think, an excellent program this afternoon about the Holocaust Remembrance. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be there to share it with you, so I just wanted to give a shout out and a welcome and let you know how we came to be here honoring our speaker, Nico Van Thyn. Well, I met Nico about 2 or 3 months ago, ironically at a basketball program for those, some of the greatest basketball players in the state of Louisiana. And Nico and I think, both wondered to ourselves, what are we doing here other than competing for the vertically challenged contest? Because we 5'9" Jewish men were surrounded in the land of giants. But the more we got to talk, the more I felt that I was there for a reason. Because Nico's story is absolutely extraordinary. Both of his parents managed to survive the Holocaust and somehow were united at the end of that reign of terror and raised a lovely family. And I should mention that I read his great book, which gave me a lot more insight, and it would be available to you on the internet if you choose to read it, which I would highly recommend. I feel like you'll certainly enjoy what he has to say and somewhat be disquieted by the fact that these issues never seem to go away. So without further ado, please welcome Nico Van Thyn.
Drove me over here, from Dallas to Fort Worth to pick me up and drove me over here. Two big guys right there, two of the best basketball players in Louisiana in 1970. And sports is what I can talk about most easily, but the Holocaust is a topic that's very important in my life, as you can understand. I've spoken periodically, including the Shreveport-Bossier Holocaust Service 8 years ago, and most recently at our seniors residency in Fort Worth, the day before Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th. And of course, that's a very noteworthy date because that was the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as you know, was the most notorious of the Nazi concentration camps in Poland and Germany. This is where my parents were prisoners for roughly 28 months, from the fall of 1942 through 1943 and 1944. When the war ended, my dad was at a mining camp near Auschwitz. My mother was in Auschwitz most of the time, but at that point, she was on the death march. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but the Nazis knew that the Russians were closing in from one side and the Americans were closing in on the other, and they moved the prisoners from Auschwitz, in my mother's case, to, I can't remember the camp right now, but it was a 600-mile journey on foot in one of the coldest winters in European history, 1945 winter. I'm going to talk today about my parents' story. That's going to be part of it. The other part is going to be about the rise of anti-Semitism today in our world, not only in America, but all over the world. I'm not here to sell my book. I'm not here to talk politics, but some of what I'm going to say is going to cross over into the political realm, and you may not agree with some of the stuff I say. That's your problem. What I'm doing today is something that my mother did for the last 25, 30 years of her life. She was a well-known speaker on the Holocaust in North Louisiana and in other places where she was invited. And in a way, you know, there are no death camps, there are no prisons, but the Jewish people, again, are the target of at least verbal abuse. So the cover of my book, let me tell you how that came about. My dad and mom both did talks, or they did interviews for the Holocaust survivors, the Hashoah Foundation, which was founded by Steven Spielberg. And the majority of what I have in the book was from those interviews, but also the stories that they told us, my sister and I, as we were growing up. A brief history of my family. My mother and dad were each married to other people when they went to the camps. Okay, their first marriages. They lost not only their first spouses, they lost their entire families. My mother lost her sister, her older sister, her parents, and my dad lost his parents and two brothers, and a sister-in-law and a 10-month-old boy whose name was Nico, the same as mine. So they survived the Holocaust. They came back to Amsterdam. They met each other. They had actually grown up in the same neighborhood, but like 3 blocks apart, but they didn't know each other. My dad was 2 years older than my mother. They knew of each other. My mother at that point was in a home. It was a converted factory for Holocaust survivors, women Holocaust survivors. My dad had moved to Belgium before the war. He was going to be an apprentice for diamond cutting. He never got that position, but he was living with an aunt in Belgium when the war broke out. And anyway, he went back to Antwerp at the end of the war, and then he was coming back to Amsterdam to see what was left there, at his home. And they had mutual friends, and anyway, they took my dad, and he went to this factory, and my mother, they met each other, and they began dating, and they got together in the late 1945, and they married in 1946. We lived in Amsterdam. I was born in Amsterdam. My sister was born in Amsterdam 4 years later. We lived there till 1955. My mother's dream was always to come to America. I'll tell you why. Both my mother and dad were liberated by the Russians, by the Russian Red Army. But my mother, long story, but I'll keep it short. My mother ended up in this, after the death march, she and a group of women that she was with had to bargain with the Russians to try to get to an American camp that was across a bridge. They didn't. The Russians were reluctant, and it took 3 or 4 days and a bunch of negotiation, and finally the Russians relented and let my mother and her group across to the American side. The Russians didn't do anything for them, okay? They didn't care about those prisoners at all. They went to the American side, and the American people, the American service people, were so good to my mother and her group. They fed them, they clothed them, they nursed them back to health. And my mother decided right there that if she ever, I'd get choked up telling this, if she ever got the chance to come to America, she would do it. And in 1953, the U.S. government loosened the visas for Holocaust survivors to come to America. My parents applied, and we were finally, actually, we're going to go to Canada first, and thank goodness we got rejected. Although I love Canada, but in 1955 we were accepted through we needed a sponsor. You got to understand, you had to have either family over here or you needed a sponsor. Well, what happened was the Shreveport Jewish Federation put up $5,000. A man in Shreveport put up $5,000. Another man there offered a job for Dad, okay? And so my mother and Dad decided this is where they wanted to come. So we went in 1955 over the Christmas holidays and New Year's. We got on a boat for a harrowing 10-day trip across the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the winter. You don't want to do that, okay? And we got to New York City on January 7th, 1956. Spent 3 days in New York City. My mother wanted to go to Radio City Music Hall because that was her dream, and she thought she'd never get back there. So we stayed in New York 3 days, got on a train, went through St. Louis, and the night before we came to Shreveport, we stopped in all places, Hope, Arkansas. Yes, and my dad was so sick of being on the train, he got up and got out of the train for a while. But anyway, so we came to Shreveport, and my dad went to work for A.A. Gilbert Pipe and Supply. When he heard that he was going to work for a pipe company, he thought it was smoking pipes. Turned out it was oil field pipe. The good thing was the A.A. Gilbert company really became our sponsors. And they were so good to us and my dad worked at that place for 29 years. and finally retired. And so I was in the 3rd grade. I was 8 years old. My sister was a 4-year-old. And we you can imagine going from Amsterdam to Shreveport, Louisiana. In the mid-50s, talk about a culture shock. Let me play a video for you here. I want to get into anti-Semitism a little bit, and then I'll come back to my parents' story.
What does your intelligence tell you about the severity of the threat Jews face in the United States today?
Regrettably, Jacob, the threat is only increasing.
For Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, tracking hate is part of the job, and the work is personal.
You're Jewish. Your mother fled the Holocaust, and you lost 9 family members in the Holocaust. How personal is this to you?
It's extraordinarily personal. My mother's experience very much shaped our understanding of the vulnerability and fragility of life, and it helps drive the imperative to eradicate hate and make people safe.
Nearly 2 years ago at your confirmation hearing, you said that you had wanted to tackle the issue of anti-Semitism once and for all. But what I hear you saying today is it's only gotten worse.
I think that's absolutely right. But our fight has only become more fervent. Our dedication to addressing targeted violence against any group has become more and more intense.
Jewish people are among the top targets of hate crimes in America. According to the FBI director, 63% of religious hate crimes are motivated by anti-Semitism. Last year, the Anti-Defamation League recorded more than 2,700 anti-Semitic incidents, a record. Preliminary numbers this year tell a similar story.
Do you think that DHS needs to be doing more?
The difficulty here is the following, that there is a fundamental right, of course, of free speech. And it is not for us to tackle that speech itself, however odious, however offensive it might be. We get involved when there's a connectivity between an ideology of hate and violence.
That potential for violence, a present and growing threat. Jacob Soboroff, NBC News, New York.
Okay, as you can imagine, there are still Holocaust deniers out there. It's hard to believe, but they're out there plenty, not only here in America, and also in Europe. And as you can tell, the anti-Semitic incidents are growing. As you can see here in Texas, 2 years ago, 112 anti-Semitic incidents compared to 50 in the years prior. Oop. Hang on.
What is your intelligence?
I don't know how to operate this. I don't know if you can tell. But here you have, I got it. I'll get around to it.
Just like
I just keep hitting the wrong button, okay? So here's an example right here in Birmingham 2 months ago. A group of white supremacists calling for a national day of hate. And, you know, that's the kind of thing we're putting up with. And so the counter to that is I don't know if you've seen these ads on TV, Stand Up to Jewish Hate. If you watch some of the sporting events, particularly, there's a little blue square. And this thing was sponsored by Robert Kraft, who's owner of the hated New England Patriots. But he's a Jewish owner, and he paid for a lot of these ads. So that's the latest campaign to try to combat the anti-Semitism, make people aware of it. Okay, our story begins in Amsterdam, which is a beautiful city, my home city, and of course, it had a really nice Jewish population before the war. And it's one of the most popular attractions there is the Anne Frank house. Anne Frank and her family moved from Germany to Holland to try to escape the Nazis. And of course, I'm sure you are pretty familiar with the Anne Frank story. Otto Frank and my dad had one thing in common at the end of the war. They were on the same boat coming back from Ukraine. Odessa, Ukraine is where my dad ended up at the end of the war, and they took a boat back to Marseille, France, and Otto Frank was one of those people on one of those boats. Okay, so here are my parents. This is what they looked like before the war. My mother was always destined to be a housewife. She married a guy right before the Nazis came in, and he was a butcher. And I think she just married him because she thought that might make her safer before the Nazis came in. My dad had gone to Antwerp, like I said. He met a French girl there, and ended up marrying her. But they both ended up as Auschwitz, as I've told you, and you're very familiar with this front gate. And overall, 5,200 Dutch Jews, or less than 25%, survived the Holocaust. Mom and Dad were in that group. And here's some numbers on the camps. I think that the most significant thing was that 107,000 Dutch Jews, 80% of the Dutch Jews, were sent to Auschwitz and the Sobibor death camp. Now, the Nazis were very meticulous record keepers. So we have dates of when my grandparents and my aunts and uncles, when they died. You see the Sobibor death camp? That's where my grandmother, my dad's mother, and his 10-year-old brother, they were sent directly there, and they died at Sobibor. Nazi ideology, of course, they treated the Jews, as you can see in this last paragraph, as anti-race, dangerous, inhuman beings in seemingly human form. They viewed the Jews as I can't say that word, parasites, or as devils, inhuman creatures with human powers. Now, these were the most, these were the symbols of my parents being in the camps. My mother's number was 62511, little bitty number on her forearm. She was a little person. You think I'm little, you should have seen my mother. She was about 4'11". This number is very little, and as you can see, when we moved to Shreveport, our Jason was 4 years old, and he asked his mother, why does Oma have her phone number on her arm? So, Dad's number was a lot bigger. It was very prominent. As you can see, the triangle there signifies Jew, and if you look at the upper left, there's a little mark there. They started doing his number there, and they messed up and just scratched it out and started over in the other place. Now, I can tell you this, I saw this happen hundreds of times. People would notice the numbers, and they would ask my parents about those numbers. My parents were always very, very patient about answering and telling the stories of these numbers. Okay, here's Dad's family. That's my dad on the left, and my grandparents and Dad's older brother, Hyman. My grandfather was just a common laborer in Amsterdam. His given name was Nathan, but everybody called him Nico. And then my dad, there you see, this is Hyman's wedding. And the little guy there is Dad's younger brother. His name was Jonas, and he was like 10 years old when he went to the camps. And this was the thing that pained my dad the most, is he could not understand why the Nazis would put a kid like him to death. You know, my dad, he could never understand that. And this was the last time that he saw his parents and his brothers. This is my mother's family. My aunt, Anna. My mother's on the right there in the back. My grandfather, Abraham, he dealt in burlap sacks, believe it or not. That was his occupation. He also taught Esperanto, which was to be a universal language, and he was an expert in that. He loved that. He tried to teach my mother that, and I don't think Mom retained any of it. But my grandmother was a housewife. She taught Mom to sew and cook, and those were two of Mom's great talents. And there's my mother with her sister and mother. And then here's two Jewish girls on the streets of Amsterdam right before the war. This picture actually was on the website of the Holocaust Museum, and somebody pointed it out to me and said it was there. And I'm sure my mother sent them this picture. But the sad part of this is the other girl, Lena, did not survive the war. Now, my mother in the camps, you know, they starved these people. They starved them, they worked them to death, they exercised them at all times. They gave them menial tasks to do. And the main thing that happened to my mother, she was in Auschwitz Block 10. That was the medical experimentation camp. So they did medical experiments on my mother. She took hundreds of shots in her chest and down below, and she never knew what kind of serum it was. They also burned them with x-ray machines down below, and the object was to sterilize them. And of this group, this was my mother's, what she called her camp sisters. There's 9 here, there were 10 in the group. One of them, this is a reunion picture of like 1953 or so. Only my mother and the woman standing in the back on the left, named Yanni, they were the only ones of this group that had kids, that were able to have kids, which was a miracle, really. There's a real story behind Yanni. I'll just give you a little bit of it. But Yanni and Mom were in elementary school together. And when they went to Auschwitz, they didn't see each other again until they went to Auschwitz. When they got off the cattle car and got in line, Yanni came up and grabbed my mother's hand and said, and you know, they remembered each other, and they said, we're going to stick together throughout this war. I get choked up telling this. Here's how close they were. Yanni's number was 62506, 5 numbers from my mother's number, okay? Yanni actually was pregnant when she went to the camp, and she was in the block with my mother, and they were extremely fortunate in that they had a doctor from Czechoslovakia, a woman doctor, who took care of Yanni and hid her away. And even though the Nazis were making fun of her, my mother told this, everybody else was losing weight, Yanni was gaining weight. So anyway, at about 6.5, 7 months, the doctor suggested to Yanni that she walk the stairs and tried to get her to go into labor, and she did. And it was a girl, and of course they took the baby, and Yanni never saw it again. And she thought about that for the rest of her life. Anyway, they survived. Yanni and her husband survived, and they became friends with my parents after the war. Yanni and her husband moved to Israel. But here, as you can tell, on the right is when Yanni and her husband came to Shreveport, and the Shreveport Times wrote a story about them and had a picture. And then the picture on the left is when my mother and dad went on their 2 trips to Israel. So anyway, they remained friends for the rest of their lives. Okay, my dad went to Antwerp, as I said, in 1935. He was going to apprentice in diamond cutting. There were no openings in Amsterdam, which was also a diamond cutting center. And in 1940, he was drafted into the Dutch army right when the war broke out. The Germans came into Holland. It took them 5 days the Dutch fought them. And what happened was the Dutch didn't think that the Nazis were going to come in there because number one, Holland had remained neutral during World War I. Number two, Hitler promised that he wouldn't invade Holland. So that was a typical Nazi Hitler promise. Anyway, Dad goes in the Army, and they get picked up. The Germans put them in a POW camp. And for 6 weeks, Dad said that all they did was sit around. They didn't do anything. The Germans, the Nazis, had not come up with the quote-unquote final solution, so they turned loose all those prisoners, and Dad went back to Antwerp. And then Dad met Estella, and they got married. They lived with her parents, and Dad, as the Nazis put in the restrictions, and you know, the Jews couldn't work anymore, they couldn't go to school, they had to wear the yellow star that signified they were Jews, and they couldn't use public transportation, couldn't go to restaurants. But Dad used to sneak out on his bicycle and deliver groceries, even at that time, which was really a risk. Anyway, then Dad got picked up. Stella also got picked up, and her parents, and he never saw any of them again. Actually, my mother went to Auschwitz from the holding camp in Holland on a cattle car. You've seen those cattle cars. And Dad actually took a regular train from Antwerp to Auschwitz. I mean, just an aside on the cattle cars, the Dallas Holocaust Museum has a cattle car that you used to have to go through that cattle car to go into the museum. I'm going to tell you, that was a tough trip for me the first time I did that, going through that cattle car. Dad took jobs in the nearby mining camps. He thought that would be easier than working in Auschwitz itself. He was in Auschwitz for a while, but then they asked for volunteers to go to the mining camps, coal mining camps, near Auschwitz. And Dad went there, and Dad 3 times was beaten severely. Once for stealing a potato, once for picking up a coat it was cold, and he was in line with all the other prisoners, and there was a coat laying there, and he thought, oh, I'll get this coat. Well, it turned out that coat belonged to a capo, which was a guard. The Germans took their prisoners out of prison and used them as guards in the concentration camps. Anyway, the coat belonged to a camp, so that was another 25 licks for Dad on his backside. And Dad came away from the war with one scar right here on his elbow, a white area on his elbow. Right before the Russians were coming, and the Nazis knew it, Dad was helping count prisoners, and he lost count. And the Nazi guard that was there, that was in charge, it teed him off. He picked up a steel hammer and whacked Dad right here and cut him open, okay? So Dad goes to the mining camp hospital. He's there with 27 other men. And when they realized that the Nazis were gone. After a couple of days, everything was quiet, and they realized the Nazis were gone. Well, what they did when the Nazis left that camp, they took all the prisoners and took them on a death march, but they left the 27 men in the camp hospital. And so Dad heard that later that they took those guys out of the camp and shot them in the woods. But Dad and these 27 people realized after a couple of days they were free. They didn't know where to go. And anyway, they ended up going to Krakow. They had heard there was a Red Cross camp there. And Dad then got with these. You see this picture? These 4 guys ended up traveling through Eastern Europe. They went through Hungary and Romania, and they wound up in Odessa, which was the Black Sea port in a part of Russia, and of course now in Ukraine. And if you look at this picture, the man sitting on the front right, Jack Frankenhouse, wrote a blog about this adventure. And about 2 years later, I got a message from Jack Frankenhouse's daughter, She had seen this picture, and she had read my blog, and so we then became friends, and she told me her dad's story. But she also had a copy of this picture. So, okay, my mother, like I said, she was a speaker all these years. She was honored often in Shreveport. She got a lot of publicity in the Shreveport Times, and this picture right here was when she spoke at the Holocaust service in 2008. And she loved talking to students. She talked to civic groups, she talked at churches, she talked at military bases, but most of all, she loved talking to students, sharing her story with students. Okay, and you can see here that there she is in her element. She was, as you can tell, a little bitty woman. The guy standing on the right there, that was the mayor of Shreveport. He was a big guy, okay? but Mom was a little bitty, but her story was powerful. And she told it well, and like I said, she was much acclaimed. And Centenary honored my mother with an honorary doctorate in humane letters in 2002, one of the great honors for our family. And you could tell she was at the head of the procession with the Centenary president. And my dad did not speak English well, okay? He spoke broken English. He had a language all his own, okay? But when Mom spoke, Dad always went with her. And the truth of it is, Dad was the better storyteller. Dad had fantastic recall of what happened to him. My mother told her story. She stuck to it, but her story was almost always the same. Dad had all sorts of stories, and he shared them with us. But he called himself Mom's designated driver. Let me tell you this: my mother was a funny, smart, well-read, but there was also a dark side. My mother paid a big price. When I was 11 years old, there was a couple of days at our house that she screamed for 48 hours. She screamed and cried, and and I'm 11 years old, my sister's 7, and it's pretty disconcerting. Dad, it was hard for Dad. Fortunately, we had people that could handle her. But throughout her life, she would have periods of mental collapse, and she would have to be hospitalized for a week or two. And she had a lot of physical ills. She had some internal problems. Her legs hurt for the last 25 years. But she was a piece of work, I'm telling you. She was an interesting person. And Dad was not as emotional, but he did have some things that he faced, some anti-Semitism that he faced. The worst part was one day in the pipe yard, he was dealing with a guy that obviously didn't like his foreign accent, and probably didn't like the deal that Dad was offering him. He picked up a 2x4 and hit Dad in the back and knocked him down. And fortunately, nothing was broken, but Dad had to be hospitalized for a couple of days. And then Dad also, I can tell you this, he never liked German things, okay? He would not ride in a Volkswagen. A couple of my coaches had Volkswagens, and they would say, "Come on, Louis, come ride with me." And Dad wasn't going to do that. He was not fond of any German products. When B and I got married, B had this table, this card table, and it was nicely crafted. B had done a really good job on it. But on the table were wine bottles, German wine bottles, okay? Dad comes in and he sees those labels and he says, "This has got to go." And it went, saving our marriage, I think. Anyway, now we've been really fortunate in Shreveport that Centenary has established a memorial lecture series to honor my parents, and they have a chair that was lots of people donated to it. Really nice honor. Okay, the Hashoah Foundation interviews. This is where I got most of the material for the book, or a lot of the material, and they did these in 1996. There's Mom, and there's Dad, and Dad was not a laugh out loud type person or a joke teller or anything, and he's laughing in this, I think, because the interview was over, okay? And as I say here, the chair he's sitting in is still in our apartment in Fort Worth. Now, Steven Spielberg has talked a lot about anti-Semitism, and I want to get to that right now. Let me get to this right here.
Sergeant, he comes over the hill here.
Steven Spielberg's new film is as close to autobiography as we will likely see.
I want to make movies, though.
The Fabelmans is deeply personal.
I've been living with the story my whole life, so this is something. I'm a very private person. I would never ordinarily take anything like this public.
And shies away from nothing, including a scene where the teenage filmmaker is set upon in high school.
Hey, new kid. What's your name?
Sam?
Sam. What?
Fableman.
Told you he's a
He doesn't like Jews.
Nobody likes Jews.
Except other Jews, right?
Well, I don't think there hasn't been a year where there hasn't been anti-Semitism in this country, throughout the world. I've been aware of it my whole life because I was certainly the subject of anti-Semitic bullying.
Incidents of anti-Semitism are up. The ADL reports 2021 had the highest level of anti-Semitic events since they started keeping track 50 years ago.
I don't remember a time in my 75 years that it's been as bad as it's gotten.
But were it ever thus, one of his most powerful films laid waste to a lie, Holocaust denial.
The list is an absolute good. The list is life.
One of the things that motivated me to do Schindler's List, because I had the book for 10 years before I actually directed the movie, was this rise of Holocaust denials.
Anti-Semitism is as ancient as the Inquisition, as current as yesterday's news.
Kanye West's Twitter and Instagram accounts have been locked because of anti-Semitic posts.
After his recent offensive comments about Jewish people.
How, we wondered, could it be drawn down? What's the answer?
But there's nothing we could really do in our culture to really move the needle. What is going to move the needle is people of opposing views and ideologies to get together into a room and start having civilized conversation with each other. You know, the only thing that is the only real treatment for this sickness is conversation. And I've always believed that, and I think that is really the only cure.
No doubt it's up to us to start the conversation. Harry Smith, NBC.
Now, I'm one of the blessed people in this world because I have never faced any anti-Semitism directly. I saw it. My sister was subjected to David Duke being dressed in a Nazi uniform on the LSU campus in about 1970 and wearing his little Nazi uniform with a swastika band and, you know, giving the Heil Hitlers. But
NBC News, Los Angeles.
I've been really lucky. Now, Charlottesville, of all the incidents that happened, this one is the most significant to me as far as the anti-Semitism. This started out, as you know, as a protest against the Confederate memorials being removed. But it turned out to be, on the Friday night, it turned out to be a Nazi rally, a Nazi-style rally. And I want you to look at that picture, those pictures right there, and tell me that there's very fine people there. Because if you'll remember, somebody in this country said there were very fine people on both sides. And they were chanting things like this: Jews will not replace us. And these are all things, of course, that were chanted in Nazi Germany. I wrote then, and I'm saying it now, for me, that was the red line. You know, to hear somebody describe these people as very fine people was unforgivable. And it was unforgivable then, and it still is. You can see what they said about Charlottesville. And then January 6th, of course, was a protest against the election, but you had this clown wearing a Camp Auschwitz shirt, and as I assured the people at Trinity Terrace in Fort Worth, he will not be invited to speak at our place there. Then the attacks on the synagogues in Pittsburgh and San Diego, in which people died. The shooter in the Pittsburgh thing's never gone to trial, and that's 5 years ago. And if you don't think it can't happen at home, Colleyville 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, where the guy held the hostages in the synagogue there. And so that happens right there. And then you've got these guys, and the same type thing as the Charlottesville marches. You can't tell me there are very fine people there. These people are anti-Semitic, and they remind me of the KKK. Patriot Front might as well be the present-day KKK. I didn't know this until I started studying this stuff a little bit. When you hear them chant 88, that means Heil Hitler. H, the 8th letter of the alphabet, Heil Hitler. And of course, this is happening all over the world. In Europe, you've got a far-right government now in Hungary. You've got a far-right candidate that did very well in France. Germany has got a lot of neo-Nazis again. Holland has a strong candidate on the far right. And so it's a danger there. And of course, the guy in Hungary, Viktor Orban, came to Dallas and gave what was at the convention there, and gave what was pure Nazi text, is what it was described. Viktor Orban. And then in our Congress, you've got Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have repeatedly made anti-Semitic remarks. And Gosar tied in with Nick Fuentes, the white nationalist figurehead Nick Fuentes, who, as you know, might have had dinner at Mar-a-Lago not too long ago. Marjorie Taylor Greene just completely wacky with her comments. I'm sorry. If you're a supporter of her, God bless you, but not here. She compared the mask mandates to gas chambers in Nazi Germany, if you can believe that. I'm stuck here, Rabbi. Ah, here we go. Sorry. Okay, and then Southlake, right there in the Fort Worth area, and they're banning books that have any reference to the camps, the Holocaust. You've got candidates, the Republican nominee for governor in Pennsylvania attacking his Jewish opponent, and then Kanye West, just a ridiculous comments about the Holocaust and about Jewish media. And unfortunately, Kyrie Irving, who is now a Dallas Maverick, or was, they traded for him, and he got suspended because he endorsed a movie that criticized the Jews, and he refused to apologize for it. And I hope the Mavericks don't re-sign him. I'm sorry. So, okay, there were 40,000 concentration camps in Germany and Poland. Here's just a map of some of them. Auschwitz was in southern Poland. And then if you want to look over this, the description of the camps where men and women were separated. I think if you know much about the Holocaust, you know some of this stuff. The showers were the gas chambers where the Nazis asphyxiated them with Zyklon B. And, you know, my mother refused to say it was luck, but I don't know what else you would call it. When they get to the camps and they separate them, they send half of them to go straight to the gas chambers, and the other half they save and use for work camps. And my mother talked about it, that it wasn't luck, but I didn't agree with my mother very much, but that was one of them. And you can see Anne Frank's friend recalled that the air smelled like burned singed meat. Here's some of the Holocaust pictures that you've seen over the years. I'm going to flip through these. You can tell how cold it was, how barren their conditions were. They got very little to eat, maybe a piece of bread, and they got a brown liquid that they called soup. My mother called it mud. They always had the line. Let me tell you the worst part. Dad, this picture reminds me of the worst story my dad told. There was a day that 6 prisoners tried to escape, and they got caught. And the Nazis emptied the whole camp and made them stand at attention. They had built gallows. They put those 6 guys up on the up there in front of the gallows, and Dad said they had to stand there for hours at attention. And finally, the Nazis hung those 6 prisoners. And as Dad said, they scare you to death. That's how he put it. Okay, this picture right here, you've heard about Eisenhower telling the American troops to take pictures because no one would believe this. This is a picture of an American soldier leading the townspeople, the German townspeople, through the camps. You can see the dead bodies laying to the side. They wanted to know, they wanted those people to know what had happened in their place. Okay. Now, I'll just tell you about this. I'm going to cut this off here, but my mother had 35 first cousins. 4 survived the war. 4. This one right here, this is he was a 10-year-old. He and his parents were hidden away in Holland, and they actually bleached his hair to try to disguise that he was Jewish. And he was in the town of Leiden. His parents were hidden on a little farm close to there. I actually knew Maurits. He was there in Amsterdam after the war, and his mother, who survived the war, his dad actually died during their hiding time. He was 39 years old. He died of heart disease. They buried him, and later they buried him in that town or on that farm, and then later on took his remains to the Jewish cemetery near Amsterdam. But anyway, Maurits and his mother, his mother lived 2 houses down from us in Amsterdam. And so I knew Maurits, and he became the editor of the Jewish newspaper in Amsterdam for 25 years. So he was the first journalist in our family, and I'm going to tell you, he was a lot better journalist than I was, because I played in the toy department of sports. So Maurits wrote about things that are important. Now, let me just say this. As I said, there are still Holocaust deniers out there. There probably always will be. It's ridiculous, but the David Dukes and Richard Spencer of Dallas are still very visible. And so we need a day like this, a Holocaust Remembrance Day in January, Holocaust Remembrance service like this, because it was a true story. I live with 2 people that lived through it, and so I know it was true. And growing up with my parents had its tough moments, but we were really blessed, and I was honored to be their son, and it is up to my generation now, with most of the Holocaust survivors gone. It's up to my generation to tell people about what happened and make sure that the story stays alive. So I thank you. I'll be glad to answer any questions afterward. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned a little something.
I'll ask everybody to please rise as I chant the El Malay, which will be followed by the Holocaust Kaddish. Ready? Sorry. It's okay. Just wait. Catching up with the technology. Go ahead. El Molei Rachamim Shochem Mavromim Chamsei Menucha Nechonat Chadvecha Shchina B'ma'alot Kedoshim U'Tchorim Kezohar Harakia Maschirim Kezohar En Nishmot Kol Acheinu B'nei Yisroel Anashim Nasim V'Tah Sheneherku V'shenit Bechu V'sheni Surechu V'shenechnenuchu Al Kiddush Hashem Mavur Shebalin Eder Etein Tzedakah Ve'al Askirat Nishmotehem Began Eden Tehi Menuchatam Ahana V'al Rachamim Hastirim V'Seifeter Kenafech Leolamim Utzrur B'Tzrur HaChagim Nishmosehem Adonai Hu Nachlasam V'Yanochu V'Shalom Nishmosehem V'Nomar Amen. Together in English. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence in the lofty levels of the holy and pure ones, who shine like the glow of the firmament, for the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, and drowned, and strangled for the sanctification of your name. May their resting place be in the world to come. Therefore, may the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shelter of God's wings for eternity, and may their souls be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. You, God, are their heritage, and may they rest in peace, and let us say, Amen. We continue with the Holocaust Kaddish. I will recite the Hebrew, and please respond in the red. Yet Gadal, Vidyet Kadash, Shemei Rabbah, Be'alma Divracher Ute, Ve'yamlich Malchute, B'chayechon V'yamechon, U'v'chaye Dechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agalal V'zaman Kariv, V'yimeru, Amen. Yeshmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Al Almei Almaya. Yet Barach V'yishtabach V'yet Pa'ar V'yet Romam V'yet Naseh V'yet Hadar V'yet Ale V'yet Halal Shemed Kudesha Berichu Le'ela Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tush B'chata V'nechemata Da'amiron V'alma V'imeru. Amen. Yehi Shalom Rabba Min Shemaya V'chaim Aleinu V'alko Yisrael V'imeru. Amen. O say Shalom B'mromav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'alko Yisrael V'imeru. Amen. Thank you. Please be seated.
Before we conclude in just a moment, I'd like to once again thank Nico and his driver, what's his name? Mike, who brought him out here from Fort Worth, for being with us today and reminding us, right? So there's still that question mark, what do we do now? But the first thing we need to do is learn and be together. There was a committee from Ahavat Achim and from our congregation Bethel that organized this, so that I just want to say thank you to them, to Kimberly and to Seth and to Gary Gross and to Amelia for organizing this, and to Rabbi Lerner for being here as well from that congregation, and myself. We are going to invite you into just a moment into the social hall. There's food, some drinks, some coffee. Time to go talk with Nico, to say hi to one another, and to have a little bit of fellowship before we head on this afternoon. We know that starting tomorrow night at sundown, will technically be Yom Hashoah, but we always do it the Sunday closest if we can. I should add, as a glimmer of hope, is what happens the following week is Yom HaAtzmaut, which is Israel Independence Day. So it's not just any old Independence Day. This year it's the 75th anniversary. So in our communities in different ways, we'll be celebrating Israel, the miracle that is and remains Israel, as we move from this period of mourning into a period of celebration. But for today, we're going to conclude with this beautiful text from Michael Walzer, and then we'll sing. If you know the words, many people do, Avosei Shalom, we'll sing together. But this is a text that we have in our prayer book, and it's really just a nice reminder of how we move from that which is painful to that which is redemptive. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before we ever stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt. That there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands and marching together. Osei Shalom bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael.
Will everybody please rise for the finer shofar blast? Thank you all for coming, and please join us in our social. Very, very good.